Chapter 9. Strangers and Carvajal. Breakfast was cold, but the tea was hot. Ice inside the windows had melted with the morning fire and soaked into the wood floor, staining it with dark puddles. Eragon looked at Garrow and Roran by the kitchen stove and reflected that this would be the last time he saw them together for many months. Roran sat in a chair, lacing his boots. His full pack rested on the floor next to him. Garrow stood between them, with his hands stuck deep into his pockets. His shirt hung loosely. His skin looked drawn. Despite the young man's cajoling, he refused to go with them. When pressed for a reason, he only said that it was for the best. "Do you have everything?" Garrow asked Roran. "Yes." He nodded and took a small pouch from his pocket. Coins clinked as he handed it to Roran. "I've been saving this for you. It isn't much, but if you wish to buy some bauble or trinket, it will suffice." "Thank you, but I won't be spending my money on trifles," said Roran. "Do with what you will. It is yours," said Garrow. "I've nothing else to give you, except a father's blessing. Take it if you wish, but it is worth little." Rowan's voice was thick with emotion. "I would be honored to receive it." "Then do, and go in peace," said Garrow, and kissed him on the forehead. He turned and said in a louder voice, "Do not think that I have forgotten you, Eragon. I have words for both of you. It is time I said them as you are entering the world. Heed them, and they will serve you well." He bent his gaze sternly on them. "First, let no one rule your mind or body. Take special care that your thoughts remain unfettered. One may be a free man and yet be bound tighter than a slave. Give men your ear, but not your heart. Show respect for those in power, but don't follow them blindly. Judge with logic and reason, but comment not. Consider none your superior, whatever their rank or station in life. Treat all fairly, or they will seek revenge. Be careful with your money. Hold fast to your beliefs, and others will listen." He continued at a slower pace. "Of the affairs of love, my only advice is to be honest. That's your most powerful tool to unlock a heart or gain forgiveness. That is all I have to say." He seemed slightly self-conscious of his speech. He hoisted Roran's pack. "Now, you must go. Dawn is approaching, and Dempton will be waiting." Roran shouldered the pack and hugged Garrow. "I will return as soon as I can," he said. "Good," replied Garrow. "But now go, and don't worry about us." They parted reluctantly. Eragon and Roran went outside, then turned and waved. Garrow raised a bony hand, his eyes grave, and watched as they trudged to the road. After a long moment, he shut the door. As the sound carried through the morning air, Roran halted. Eragon looked back and surveyed the land. His eyes lingered on the lone buildings. They looked pitifully small and fragile. A thin finger of smoke trailing up from the house was the only proof that the snowbound farm was inhabited. "There is our entire world," Roran observed somberly. Eragon shivered impatiently and grumbled, "A good one, too." Roran nodded, then straightened his shoulders and headed into his new future. The house disappeared from view as they descended the hill. It was still early when they reached Carvajal, but they found the smithy doors already open. The air inside was pleasantly warm. Baldur slowly worked two large bellows attached to the side of a stone forge filled with sparkling coals. Before the forge stood a black anvil and an iron-bound barrel filled with brine. From a line of neck-high poles protruding from the walls hung rows of items: giant tongs, pliers, hammers in every shape and weight, chisels, angles, center punches, files, rasps, lathes, bars of iron and steel waiting to be shaped, vises, shears, picks, and shovels. Horst and Dempton stood next to a long table. Dempton approached with a smile beneath his flamboyant red mustache. "Roran! I'm glad you came. There's going to be more work than I can handle with my new grindstones. Are you ready to go?" Roran hefted his pack. "Yes. Do we leave soon?" "I've a few things to take care of first, but we'll be off within the hour." Eragon shifted his feet as Dempton turned to him, tugging at the corner of his mustache. "You must be Eragon. I would offer you a job too, but Roran got the only one. Maybe in a year or two, eh?" Eragon smiled uneasily and shook his hand. The man was friendly. Under other circumstances, Eragon would have liked him, but right then he sourly wished that the miller had never come to Carvajal. Dempton huffed. "Good, very good." He returned his attention to Roran and started to explain how a mill worked. "They're ready to go," interrupted Horst, gesturing at the table where several bundles rested. "You can take them whenever you want to." They shook hands, then Horst left the smithy, beckoning to Eragon on the way out. Interested, Eragon followed. He found the smith standing in the street with his arms crossed. Eragon thrust his thumb back toward the miller and asked, "What do you think of him?" Horst rumbled. "A good man. He'll do fine with Roran." He accidentally brushed metal filings off his apron, then put a massive hand on Eragon's shoulder. "Lad, do you remember the fight you had with Sloane?" "If you're asking about payment for the meat, I haven't forgotten." "No, I trust you, lad. What I wanted to know is if you still have that blue stone." Eragon's heart fluttered. What does he want to know? Maybe someone saw Saphira. Struggling not to panic, he said, "I do, but why do you ask?" "As soon as you return home, get rid of it." Horst overrode Eragon's exclamation. "2 men arrived here yesterday. Strange fellows dressed in black, carrying swords. It made my skin crawl just to look at them. Last evening they started asking people if a stone like yours had been found. They're at it again today." Eragon blanched. "No one with any sense said anything. They know trouble when they see it, but I could name a few people who will talk." Dread filled Eragon's heart. Whoever had sent the stone into the spine had finally tracked it down. Or perhaps the Empire had learned of Saphira. He did not know which would be worse. Think! The egg is gone. It's impossible for them to find it now. But if they know what it is, it'll be obvious what happened. Saphira might be in danger. It took all of his self-control to retain a casual air. "Thanks for telling me. Do you know where they are?" He was proud that his voice had barely trembled. "I didn't warn you because I thought you needed to meet those men. Leave Carvajal. Go home." "All right," said Eragon, to placate the smith, "if you think I should." "I do." Horst's face softened. "I may be overreacting, but these strangers give me a bad feeling. It would be better if you stay home until they leave. I'll try to keep them away from your farm, though it may not do any good." Eragon looked at him gratefully. He wished he could tell him about Saphira. "I'll leave now," he said, and hurried back to Roran. Eragon clasped his cousin's arm and bade him farewell. "Aren't you going to stay a while?" Roran asked with surprise. Eragon almost laughed. For some reason, the question struck him as funny. "There's nothing for me to do, and I'm not going to stand around until you go." "Well," said Roran doubtfully, "I guess this is the last time we'll see each other for a few months." "I'm sure it won't seem that long," said Eragon hastily. "Take care and come back soon." He hugged Roran, then left. Horst was still in the street. Aware that the smith was watching, Eragon headed to the outskirts of Carvajal. Once the smithy was out of sight, he ducked behind a house and sneaked back through the village. Eragon kept to the shadows as he searched each street, listening for the slightest noise. His thoughts flashed to his room, where his bow hung. He wished it was in his hand. He prowled across Carvajal, avoiding everyone until he heard a sibilant voice from around a house. Although his ears were keen, he had to strain to hear what was being said. "When did this happen?" The words were smooth, like oiled glass, and seemed to worm their way through the air. Underlying the speech was a strange hiss that made his scalp prickle. "About 3 months ago," someone else answered. Eragon identified him as Sloane. Shades blood, he's telling them. He resolved to punch Sloane the next time they met. A third person spoke. The voice was deep and moist. It conjured up images of creeping decay, mold, and other things best left untouched. "Are you sure? We would hate to think you had made a mistake." "If that were so, it would be most unpleasant." Eragon could only imagine too well what they might do. Would anyone but the Empire dare threaten people like that? Probably not, but whoever sent the egg might be powerful enough to use force with impunity. "Yeah, I am sure. He had it then. I'm not lying. Plenty of people know about it. Go ask them." Sloane sounded shaken. He said something else that Eragon did not catch. "They have been rather uncooperative." The words were derisive. There was a pause. "Your information has been helpful. We will not forget you." Eragon believed him. Sloane muttered something. Then Eragon heard someone hurrying away. He peered around the corner to see what was happening. 2 tall men stood in the street. Both were dressed in long black cloaks that were lifted up by sheaths poking past their legs. On their shirts were insignias intricately wrought with silver thread. Hoods shaded their faces, and their hands were covered by gloves. Their backs were oddly humped, as though their clothes were stuffed with padding. Eragon shifted slightly to get a better view. One of the strangers stiffened and grunted peculiarly to his companion. They both swiveled around and sank into crouches. Eragon's breath caught. Mortal fear clenched him. His eyes locked onto their hidden faces, and a stifling power fell over his mind, keeping him in place. He struggled against it and screamed to himself, "Move!" His legs swayed, but to no avail. The stranger stalked toward him with a smooth, noiseless gait. He knew they could see his face now. They were almost to the corner, hands grasping at swords. "Eragon!" He jerked as his name was called. The strangers froze in place and hissed. Brom hurried toward him from the side, head bare and staff in hand. The strangers were blocked from the odd man's view. Eragon tried to warn him, but his tongue and arms would not stir. "Eragon!" cried Brom again. The strangers gave Eragon one last look, then slipped away between the houses. Eragon collapsed to the ground, shivering. Sweat beaded on his forehead and made his palms sticky. The old man offered Eragon a hand and pulled him up with a strong arm. "You look sick. Is all well?" Eragon gulped and nodded mutely. His eyes flickered around, searching for anything unusual. "I just got dizzy all of a sudden. It's passed. It was very odd. I don't know why it happened." "You'll recover," said Brom, "but perhaps it would be better if you went home." "Yes, I have to get home. I have to get there before they do." "I think you're right. Maybe I'm getting ill." "Then home is the best place for you. It's a long walk, but I'm sure you'll feel better by the time you arrive. Let me escort you to the road." Eragon did not protest as Brom took his arm and led him away at a quick pace. Brom's staff crunched in the snow as they passed the houses. "Why were you looking for me?" Brom shrugged. "Simple curiosity. I learned that you were in town and wondered if you had remembered the name of that traitor." "Traitor? What is he talking about?" Eragon stared blankly. His confusion caught the attention of Brahm's probing eyes. "No," he said, and then amended himself. "I'm afraid I still don't remember." Brahm sighed gruffly, as if something had been confirmed, and rubbed his eagle nose. "Well, then, if you do, come tell me. I am most interested in this traitor who pretends to know so much about dragons." Eragon nodded with a distracted air. They walked in silence to the road. Then Brahm said, "Hasten home. I don't think it would be a good idea to tarry on the way." He offered a gnarled hand. Eragon shook it, but as he let go, something in Brahm's hand caught on his mitt and pulled it off. It fell to the ground. The old man picked it up. "Clumsy of me," he apologized, and handed it back. As Eragon took the mitt, Brahm's strong fingers wrapped around his wrist and twisted sharply. His palm briefly faced upward, revealing the silvery mark. Brahm's eyes glinted, but he let Eragon yank his hand back and jam it into the mitt. "Goodbye," Eragon forced out, perturbed, and hurried down the road. Behind him, he heard Brahm whistling a merry tune. Chapter 10. Flight of Destiny. Eragon's mind churned as he sped on his way. He ran as fast as he could, refusing to stop even when his breath came in great gasps. As he pounded down the cold road, he cast out with his mind for Saphira, but she was too far away for him to contact. He thought about what to say to Garrow. There was no choice now. He would have to reveal Saphira. He arrived home, panting for air and heart pounding. Garrow stood by the barn with the horses. Eragon hesitated. Should I talk to him now? He won't believe me unless Saphira is here. I'd better find her first. He slipped around the farm and into the forest. "Saphira!" he shouted with his thoughts. "I come," was the dim reply. Through the words, he sensed her alarm. He waited impatiently, though it was not long before the sound of her wings filled the air. She landed amid a gout of smoke. "What happened?" she queried. He touched her shoulder and closed his eyes. Calming his mind, he quickly told her what had occurred. When he mentioned the strangers, Saphira recoiled. She reared and roared deafeningly, then whipped her tail over his head. He scrambled back in surprise, ducking as her tail hit a snowdrift. Bloodlust and fear emanated from her in great, sickening waves. "Fire! Enemies! Death! Murderers!" "What's wrong?" He put all his strength into the words, but an iron wall surrounded her mind, shielding her thoughts. She let out another roar and gouged the earth with her claws, tearing the frozen ground. "Stop it! Garrow will hear!" Oaths betrayed, souls killed, eggs shattered, blood everywhere. Murderers! Frantic, he blocked out Saphira's emotions and watched her tail. When it flicked past him, he dashed to her side and grabbed a spike on her back. Clutching it, he pulled himself into the small hollow at the base of her neck and held on tightly as she reared again. "Enough, Saphira!" he bellowed. Her stream of thoughts ceased abruptly. He ran a hand over her scales. "Everything's going to be all right." She crouched, and her wings rushed upward. They hung there for an instant, then drove down as she flung herself into the sky. Eragon yelled as the ground dropped away, and they rose above the trees. Turbulence buffeted him, snatching the breath out of his mouth. Saphira ignored his terror and banked toward the spine. Underneath, he glimpsed the farm and the Anora River. His stomach convulsed. He tightened his arms around Saphira's neck and concentrated on the scales in front of his nose, trying not to vomit as she continued to climb. When she leveled off, he gained the courage to look around. The air was so cold that frost accumulated on his eyelashes. They had reached the mountains faster than he thought possible. From the air, the peaks looked like giant razor-sharp teeth waiting to slash them to ribbons. Saphira wobbled unexpectedly, and Eragon heaved over her side. He wiped his lips, tasting vile, and buried his head against her neck. "We have to go back," he pleaded. "The strangers are coming to the farm. Garrow has to be warned. Turn around!" There was no answer. He reached for her mind, but was blocked by a barrier of roiling fear and anger. Determined to make her turn around, he grimly wormed into her mental armor. He pushed at its weak places, undermined the stronger sections, and fought to make her listen, but to no avail. Soon mountains surrounded them, forming tremendous white walls broken by granite cliffs. Blue glaciers sat between the summits, like frozen rivers. Long valleys and ravines opened beneath them. He heard the dismayed screech of birds far below as Saphira soared into view. He saw a herd of woolly goats bounding from ledge to ledge on a rocky bluff. Eragon was battered by swirling gusts from Saphira's wings, and whenever she moved her neck, he was tossed from side to side. She seemed tireless. He was afraid she was going to fly through the night. Finally, as darkness fell, she tilted into a shallow dive. He looked ahead and saw that they were headed for a small clearing in a valley. Saphira spiraled down, leisurely drifting over the treetops. She pulled back as the ground neared, filled her wings with air, and landed on her rear legs. Her powerful muscles rippled as they absorbed the shock of impact. She dropped to all fours and skipped a step to keep her balance. Eragon slid off without waiting for her to fold her wings. As he struck the ground, his knees buckled and his cheeks slammed against the snow. He gasped as excruciating pain seared through his legs, sending tears to his eyes. His muscles, cramped from clenching for so long, shook violently. He rolled onto his back, shivering, and stretched his limbs as best he could. Then he forced himself to look down. 2 large blots darkened his wool pants on the insides of his thighs. He touched the fabric. It was wet. Alarmed, he peeled off the pants and grimaced. The insides of his legs were raw and bloody. The skin was gone, rubbed off by Saphira's hard scales. He gingerly felt the abrasions and winced. Cold bit into him as he pulled the pants back on, and he cried out as they scraped against the sensitive wounds. He tried to stand, but his legs would not support him. The deepening night obscured his surroundings. The shaded mountains were unfamiliar. "Okay, I'm in the spine, I don't know where, during the middle of winter, with a crazed dragon, unable to walk or find shelter. Night is falling. I have to get back to the farm tomorrow. The only way to do that is to fly, which I can't endure anymore." He took a deep breath. I wish Saphira could breathe fire. He turned his head and saw her next to him, crouched low to the ground. He put a hand on her side and found it trembling. The barrier in her mind was gone. Without it, her fear scorched through him. He clamped down on it and slowly soothed her with gentle images. "Why did the strangers frighten you?" "Murderers," she hissed. "Garrow is in danger, and you kidnapped me on this ridiculous journey. Are you unable to protect me?" She growled deeply and snapped her jaws. But if you think you can, why run?" "Death is a poison." He leaned on one elbow and stifled his frustration. "Saphira, look where we are. The sun is down, and your flight has stripped my legs as easily as I would scale a fish. Is that what you wanted?" "No." "Then why did you do it?" he demanded. Through his link with Saphira, he felt her regret for his pain, but not for her actions. She looked away and refused to answer. The icy temperature deadened Eragon's legs. Although it lessened the pain, he knew that his condition was not good. He changed tack. "I'm going to freeze unless you make me a shelter or hollow so I can stay warm. Even a pile of pine needles and branches would do." She seemed relieved that he had stopped interrogating her. "There is no need. I will curl around you and cover you with my wings. The fire inside me will stay the cold. Eragon let his head thump back on the ground. Fine, but scrape the snow off the ground. It'll be more comfortable. In answer, Saphira raised a drift with her tail, clearing it with one powerful stroke. She swept over the site again to remove the last few inches of hardened snow. He eyed the exposed dirt with distaste. I can't walk over there. You'll have to help me to it. Her head, larger than his torso, swung over him and came to rest by his side. He stared at her large, sapphire-colored eyes and wrapped his hands around one of her ivory spikes. She gently lifted her head and slowly dragged him to the bare spot. Gently, gently! Stars danced in his eyes as he slid over a rock, but he managed to hold on. After he let go, Saphira rolled on her side, exposing her warm belly. He huddled against the smooth scales of her underside. Her right wing extended over him and enclosed him in complete darkness, forming a living tent. Almost immediately, the air began to lose its rigidity. He pulled his arms inside his coat and tied the empty sleeves around his neck. For the first time, he noticed that hunger gnawed at his stomach. But it did not distract him from his main worry. Could he get back to the farm before the strangers did? And if not, what would happen? Even if I can force myself to ride Saphira again, it'll be at least mid-afternoon before we get back. The strangers could be there long before that. He closed his eyes and felt a single tear slide down his face. What have I done? Chapter 11. The Doom of Innocence. When Eragon opened his eyes in the morning, he thought the sky had fallen. An unbroken plain of blue stretched over his head and slanted to the ground. Still half asleep, he reached out tentatively and felt a thin membrane under his fingers. It took him a long minute to realize what he was staring at. He bent his neck slightly and glared at the scaly haunch his head rested on. Slowly, he pushed his legs out from his fetal curl, scabs cracking. The pain had subsided some from yesterday, but he shrank from the thought of walking. Burning hunger reminded him of his missed meals. He summoned the energy to move and pounded weakly on Saphira's side. "Hey! Wake up!" he yelled. She stirred and lifted her wing to emit a torrent of sunshine. He squinted as the snow momentarily blinded him. Beside him, Saphira stretched like a cat and yawned, flashing rows of white teeth. When Eragon's eyes adjusted, he examined where they were. Imposing and unfamiliar mountains surrounded them, casting deep shadows on the clearing. Off to one side, he saw a trail cut through the snow and into the forest, where he could hear the muffled gurgling of a creek. Groaning, he stood and swayed, then stiffly hobbled to a tree. He grabbed one of the branches and threw its weight. Groaning, he stood and swayed, then stiffly hobbled to a tree. He grabbed one of its branches and threw his weight against it. It held, then broke with a loud crack. He ripped off the twigs, fit one end of the branch under his arm, and planted the other firmly in the ground. With the help of his improvised crutch, he limped to the iced-over creek. He broke through the hard shell and cupped the clear, bitter water. Sated. I did so well earlier. Groaning, he stood and swayed, then stiffly hobbled to a tree. He grabbed one of its branches and threw his weight against it. It held, then broke with a loud crack. He ripped off the twigs, fit one end of the branch under his arm, and planted the other firmly in the ground. With the help of his improvised crutch, he limped to the iced-over creek. He broke through the hard shell and cupped the clear, bitter water. sated, he returned to the clearing. As he emerged from the trees, sated, he returned to the clearing. As he emerged from the trees, he finally recognized the mountains and the lay of the land. This was where, amid deafening sound, Saphira's egg had first appeared. He sagged against a rough trunk. There could be no mistake, for now he saw the gray trees that had been stripped of their needles in the explosion. How did Saphira know where this was? She was still in the egg. My memories must have given her enough information to find it. He shook his head in silent astonishment. Saphira was waiting patiently for him. "Will you take me home?" he asked her. She cocked her head. "I know you don't want to, but you must. Both of us carry an obligation to Garrow. He has cared for me, and, through me, you. Would you ignore that debt? What will be said of us in years to come if we don't return? That we hid like cowards while my uncle was in danger? I can hear it now, the story of the rider and his craven dragon. If there will be a fight, let us face it and not shy away. You are a dragon. Even a shade would run from you, yet you crouch in the mountains like a frightened rabbit." Eragon meant to anger her, and he succeeded. A growl rippled in her throat as her head jabbed within a few inches of his face. She bared her fangs and glared at him, smoke trailing from her nostrils. He hoped that he had not gone too far. Her thoughts reached him, red with anger. "Blood will meet blood. I will fight. Our words, our fates bind us. But try me not. I will take you because of debt owed. But into foolishness we fly." "Foolishness or not," he said into the air, "there is no choice. We must go." He ripped his shirt in half and stuffed a piece into each side of his pants. Gingerly, he hoisted himself onto Saphira and took a tight hold on her neck. "This time," he told her, "fly lower and faster. Time is of the essence." "Don't let go," she cautioned, then surged into the sky. They rose above the forest and leveled out immediately, barely staying above the branches. Eragon's stomach lurched. He was glad it was empty. "Faster, faster," he urged. She said nothing, but the beat of her wings increased. He screwed his eyes shut and hunched his shoulders. He had hoped that the extra padding of his shirt would protect him, but every movement sent pangs through his legs. Soon lines of hot blood trickled down his calves. Concern emanated from Saphira. She went even faster now, her wings straining. The land sped past as if it were being pulled out from under them. Eragon imagined that to someone on the ground, they were just a blur. By early afternoon, Palancar Valley lay before them. Clouds obscured his vision to the south. Carvajal was to the north. Saphira glided down while Eragon searched for the farm. When he spotted it, fear jolted him. A black plume with orange flames dancing at its base rose from the farm. "Saphira!" he pointed. "Get me down there! Now!" She locked her wings and tilted into a steep dive, hurtling groundward at a frightening rate. Then she altered her dive slightly, so they sped toward the forest. He yelled over the screaming air, "Land in the fields!" He held on tighter as they plummeted. Saphira waited until they were only 100 feet off the ground before driving her wings downward in several powerful strokes. She landed heavily, breaking his grip. He crashed to the ground, then staggered upright, gasping for breath. The house had been blasted apart. Timbers and boards that had been walls and roof were strewn across a wide area. The wood was pulverized, as if a giant hammer had smashed it. Sooty shingles lay everywhere. A few twisted metal plates were all that remained of the stove. The snow was perforated with smashed white crockery and chunks of bricks from the chimney. Thick, oily smoke billowed from the barn, which burned fiercely. The farm animals were gone, either killed or frightened away. "Uncle!" Eragon ran to the wreckage, hunting through the destroyed rooms for Garrow. There was no sign of him. "Uncle!" Eragon cried again. Saphira walked around the house and came to his side. "Sorrow breeds here," she said. "This wouldn't have happened if you hadn't run away with me." "You would not be alive if we had stayed." "Look at this!" he screamed. "We could have warned Garrow. It's your fault he didn't get away." He slammed his fist against a pole, splitting the skin on his knuckles. Blood dripped down his fingers as he stalked out of the house. He stumbled to the path that led to the road and bent down to examine the snow. Several tracks were before him, but his vision was blurry and he could barely see. "Am I going blind?" he wondered. With a shaking hand, he touched his cheeks and found them wet. A shadow fell on him, as Saphira loomed overhead, sheltering him with her wings. "Take comfort. All may not be lost." He looked up at her, searching for hope. "Examine the trail. My eyes see only 2 sets of prints. Garrow could not have been taken from here." He focused on the trampled snow. The faint imprints of 2 pairs of leather boots headed toward the house. On top of those were traces of the same 2 sets of boots leaving, and whoever had made the departing tracks had been carrying the same weight as when they arrived. "You're right. Garrow has to be here." He leapt to his feet and hurried back to the house. "I will search around the buildings and in the forest," said Saphira. Eragon scrambled into the remains of the kitchen and frantically started digging through a pile of rubble. Pieces of debris that he could not have moved normally now seemed to shift on their own accord. A cupboard, mostly intact, stymied him for a second, then he heaved it and sent it flying. As he pulled on a board, something rattled behind him. He spun around, ready for an attack. A hand extended from under a section of collapsed roof. It moved weakly, and he grasped it with a cry. "Uncle, can you hear me?" There was no response. Eragon tore at pieces of wood, heedless of the splinters that pierced his hands. He quickly exposed an arm and a shoulder, but was barred by a heavy beam. He threw his shoulder at it and shoved with every fiber of his being, but it defied his efforts. "Saphira, I need you!" She came immediately. Wood cracked under her feet as she crawled over the ruined walls. Without a word, she nosed past him and set her side against the beam. Her claws sank into what was left of the floor. Her muscles strained. With a grating sound, the beam lifted, and Eragon rushed under it. Garrow lay on his stomach, his clothes mostly torn off. Eragon pulled him out of the rubble. As soon as they were clear, Saphira released the beam, leaving it to crash on the floor. Eragon dragged Garrow out of the destroyed house and eased him to the ground. Dismayed, he touched his uncle gently. His skin was gray, lifeless, and dry, as if a fever had burned off any sweat. His lip was split, and there was a long scrape on his cheekbone, but that was not the worst. Deep, ragged burns covered most of his body. They were chalky white and oozed clear liquid. A cloying, sickening smell hung over him, the odor of rotting fruit. His breath came in short jerks, each one sounding like a death rattle. "Murderers," hissed Saphira. "Don't say that. He can still be saved. We have to get him to Gertrude. I can't carry him to Carvajal, though." Saphira presented an image of Garrow hanging under her while she flew. Can you lift both of us?" "I must." Eragon dug through the rubble until he found a board and leather thongs. He had Saphira pierce a hole with a claw at each of the board's corners. Then he looped a piece of leather through each hole and tied them to her forelegs. After checking to make sure the knots were secure, he rolled Garrow onto the board and lashed him down. As he did, a scrap of black cloth fell from his uncle's hand. It matched the stranger's clothing. He angrily stuffed it into a pocket, mounted Saphira, and closed his eyes as his body settled into a steady throb of pain. "Now!" She leapt up, hind legs digging into the ground. Her wings clawed at the air as she slowly climbed. Tendons strained and popped as she battled gravity. For a long, painful second, nothing happened. But then she lunged forward powerfully, and they rose higher. Once they were over the forest, Eragon told her, "Follow the road. It'll give you enough room if you have to land." "I might be seen." "It doesn't matter anymore." She argued no further as she veered to the road and headed for Carvajal. Garrow swung wildly underneath them. Only the slender leather cords kept him from falling. The extra weight slowed Saphira. Before long her head sagged, and there was froth at her mouth. She struggled to continue, yet they were almost a league from Carvajal when she locked her wings and sank toward the road. Her hind feet touched with a shower of snow. Eragon tumbled off her, landing heavily on his side to avoid hurting his legs. He struggled to his feet and worked to untie the leather from Saphira's legs. Her thick panting filled the air. "Find a safe place to rest," he said. "I don't know how long I'll be gone, so you're going to have to take care of yourself for a while." "I will wait," she said. He gritted his teeth and began to drag Garrow down the road. The first few steps sent an explosion of agony through him. "I can't do this!" he howled at the sky. Then took a few more steps. His mouth locked into a snarl. He stared at the ground between his feet as he forced himself to hold a steady pace. It was a fight against his unruly body, a fight he refused to lose. The minutes crawled by at an excruciating rate. Each yard he covered seemed many times that. With desperation, he wondered if Carvajal still existed, or if the strangers had burnt it down too. After a time, through a haze of pain, he heard shouting and looked up. Brom was running toward him, eyes large, hair awry, and one side of his head caked with dry blood. He waved his arms wildly before dropping his staff and grabbing Eragon's shoulders, saying something in a loud voice. Eragon blinked uncomprehendingly. Without warning, the ground rushed up to meet him. He tasted blood, then blacked out.